Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the money in your pocket, the dollars in your bank account, the currency the entire world depends on, is quietly losing its power. Not slowly, not over decades, but fast enough that people can feel it in their daily lives. Gas prices jumping overnight, groceries costing more every week, savings melting away while wages fall behind. Now imagine this happening in the United States, because it already did. In the 1970s, the US dollar came closer to collapse than most Americans realize. Confidence in America's money was breaking down, at home and around the world. Foreign governments were dumping dollars. Inflation surged into double digits. Gold vanished from store shelves, and many economists genuinely believed the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency was coming to an end. Yet today, almost no one talks about it. There's no annual memorial, no major Hollywood movie, no clear place in the popular financial narrative. So the question is simple and unsettling. How did the dollar almost die? And why has this crisis been quietly erased from memory? That's the story we're telling today. The world before the crisis. To understand how close the dollar came to collapse, we need to rewind to the world before the 1970s. After World War II, the United States stood alone. Europe was devastated. Japan was rebuilding. The U.S. held most of the world's gold, controlled global trade, and emerged as the dominant economic power on Earth. Out of that moment came the Bretton Woods system. Under this system, the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and other global currencies were pegged to the dollar. In effect, the dollar became the center of the global financial system, as good as gold. For decades, this worked. America exported goods. America lent dollars to the world. America ran the system. But there was a flaw hidden beneath the surface. To supply the world with dollars, the United States had to keep spending, and spending eventually turned into borrowing. Cracks in the gold standard. By the 1960s, the U.S. was fighting a costly war in Vietnam, while also funding massive social programs at home. The result? Deficits. More dollars flowing overseas, and growing doubt that the U.S. actually had enough gold to back all the dollars it had created. Foreign governments began to notice. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, openly questioned America's promises. French ships sailed to New York carrying dollars, demanding gold in return. Other countries followed. Gold began leaving U.S. vaults at an alarming rate. By the late 1960s, it was becoming clear that the math didn't work anymore. There were far more dollars in circulation than gold to back them, and the world knew it. The Nixon Shock. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and made one of the most consequential financial announcements in American history. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. No debate, no international agreement, no warning. This moment became known as the Nixon Shock. In a single decision, the global monetary system that had existed for over 25 years was effectively ended. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by something far more fragile: confidence. At the time, Nixon framed it as a temporary move, but it wasn't. The gold window never reopened. And once the world realized that the dollar was now a pure fiat currency, the reaction was swift and brutal. Inflation exploded. The 1970s became a decade Americans would never forget, at least not those who lived through it. Inflation surged. Prices didn't just rise, they spiraled. By the late 1970s, inflation hit double digits, peaking at over 13%. That means money lost value not over years, but over months. Savings evaporated, fixed incomes were crushed, wages couldn't keep up. Gas lines stretched for blocks during the oil shocks. People waited hours just to fill their tanks. Interest rates soared. Mortgages became nearly impossible to afford. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it was a crisis of trust. People stopped believing the dollar would hold its value, and when trust in money breaks, the entire system begins to shake. The world loses faith. The crisis wasn't limited to the U.S. Internationally, confidence in the dollar deteriorated rapidly. Countries questioned why they should hold reserves in a currency that was inflating away its value. Gold prices exploded, rising from $35 an ounce to over $800 by 1980. This wasn't speculation, it was fear. Gold wasn't rising because it was becoming more valuable, the dollar was falling. Some economists openly argued that the dollar would lose its role as the global reserve currency. Others predicted a return to gold. Some believed America's financial dominance was ending for good. For a brief moment in history, the future of the dollar was genuinely uncertain. Why this crisis was different? America had faced inflation before. It had faced recessions, panics, depressions. But the 1970s were different. This was the first time the U.S. operated entirely without a gold anchor. There was no safety net, no hard limit on money creation, no automatic discipline, and policymakers didn't know how to handle it. Early responses made things worse. Interest rates stayed too low. Spending continued. Inflation expectations became embedded in daily life. People expected prices to rise, so they spent faster. That feedback loop is deadly for a currency. Once it starts, stopping it becomes extremely painful. Enter Paul Volcker. By 1979, the situation was desperate. President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker understood something critical. Inflation wasn't just an economic problem, it was a psychological one. To save the dollar, confidence had to be restored, no matter the cost. And the cost was enormous. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively. Eventually, rates climbed above 20%. Businesses collapsed, unemployment surged, the economy plunged into a deep recession. It was brutal. But it worked. Inflation broke. Confidence slowly returned, and the dollar survived. Barely. Why no one talks about it? So why isn't this crisis remembered the way the Great Depression or 2008 is? Because there was no single crash, no iconic stock market collapse, no mass bank failures, no dramatic overnight implosion. Instead, it was a slow erosion, painful, humiliating, and deeply unsettling. And perhaps most importantly, it challenged a powerful myth, the myth that the dollar is invincible, that America's money always wins, that crises only happen elsewhere. The 1970s proved otherwise, and uncomfortable truths have a way of quietly disappearing from the story we tell ourselves. The long shadow of the 1970s. Even today, the legacy of the 1970s shapes policy decisions. Central banks obsess over inflation, not because it's theoretical, but because they remember what happens when control is lost. The dollar's dominance today rests not on gold, but on trust, institutions, and history. And history shows that trust can be broken. The 1970s weren't an accident. They were the result of choices, and the same forces, debt, deficits, geopolitical pressure, and confidence still exist. The dollar didn't survive the 1970s because it was guaranteed to. It survived because extreme measures were taken at enormous cost. High interest rates, recession, political pain. and a willingness to do what was necessary to restore trust. That's the lesson history leaves us. Currencies don't collapse overnight. They erode, they weaken, they lose confidence, quietly, until suddenly. The 1970s remind us that even the world's most powerful currency is not immune to history, and forgetting that may be the most dangerous mistake of all. If this video changed the way you think about the US dollar, not as a symbol but as a system shaped by history, make sure to like this video. It helps more people discover financial documentary. Subscribe for deep dives into the hidden forces behind money, power, and financial history. And let us know in the comments, do you think the lessons of the 1970s are still being remembered or quietly ignored? Explore more videos right here on Financial Documentary, where the past explains the present.